This afternoon, we are here to explore the issue and the role of race in presidential politics, a topic that has not frequently been discussed in many public settings. Race has played a major role in presidential politics for over a century. Until the 1930s, for example, most African Americans voted Republican out of loyalty to the party of Abraham Lincoln. And while Franklin Roosevelt was able to break this pattern as late as 1956, blacks voted Republican in the re-election of Dwight Eisenhower at a rate higher than at any point since 1932. So in 1960, the African American vote was up for grabs, and a presidential election that was to be a true squeaker was very much up for grabs. John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon both sought to capture the urban black vote in the North while not alienating the white voting bloc in the South. Kennedy and Nixon each lined up the support of respected black leaders, with a national icon like Jackie Robinson, for example, campaigning for Nixon. Let's listen to a couple of radio announcements and one TV spot from our archives to see how the Kennedy campaign attempted to frame the election for African American voters. Could we have the tapes?
Presidential campaign. His name, Senator John Kennedy, on the Democratic ticket. Now, what I like about Senator Kennedy is this. He talks straight. He's not afraid to say that the years ahead are going to be tough. He's not afraid of losing votes by speaking up for things he believes in. Sit-in demonstrations, nationwide FEPC, and $1.25 minimum wage.
Hi there. This is Ella Fitzgerald. I just want to tell you that in this big national election coming up, I'm going to do the right thing and vote for the Democratic ticket. I hope you will, too. I've got a candidate I can really believe in this time, Senator John F. Kennedy by name. I remember how President Roosevelt gave our people a feeling of hope that they could prove themselves by their ability here in America.
This is your old friend Cab Calloway, folks, singing in praise of Senator John Kennedy, the man I'm swinging my vote to on November the 8th. It's no secret which party has a heart as big as a whale. It's a Democratic Party that cares about people.
Listen to Dr. Ralph D. Abernathy of Montgomery, Alabama, President of the Montgomery Improvement Association and Secretary-Treasurer of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
I honestly and sincerely feel that it is time for all of us to take off our Nixon buttons. Senator Kennedy did something great and wonderful when he personally called Mrs. Coretta King and helped free Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. This was the kind of act I was waiting for. It was not just Dr. King on trial. America was on trial.
Hi, my name is Harry Belafonte. I'm an artist, and I'm not a politician. But like most Americans, I have a great interest in the political and the economic destiny of my country. I'm seated here with Senator Jack Kennedy. As a Negro and as an American, I have many questions, and I'm sure everyone does, about civil rights, about foreign policy, about the economy of the country, and about things that'll happen.
And I want to make it very clear, Harry, that on this question of equality of opportunity for all Americans, whether it's in the field of civil rights, better minimum wages, better housing, better working conditions, jobs, I stand for these things. The Democratic Party under Franklin Roosevelt stood for them.
I'm voting for this, Senator. How about you?
Vote for a leader like Roosevelt. Vote for John F. Kennedy for president.
So those were some of the campaign spots that Senator John F. Kennedy used in 1960. As we heard from Reverend Ralph David Abernathy's announcement, the telephone call that Senator Kennedy made to Mrs. Martin Luther King about the arrest of her husband was a key factor that affected the outcome of one of the closest presidential elections in history. On Election Day, Kennedy carried the black vote while holding on to the South. In Illinois, for example, the total margin of his victory was a mere 9,000 votes in one of the most tightly contested states, while he won the vast majority of the black vote with some 250,000 African-American voters voting Democratic. Our opening speaker tonight is Jeremy Meyer, who is the author of a new book, Running on Race, Racial Politics, and Presidential Campaigns. And Professor Meyer notes that the 1960 race is the crucible in which the pattern of modern racial politics was forged. He teaches at George Mason School of Public Policy and has been a visiting professor of government at Georgetown University, where he did his graduate work in politics. And his book is on sale in our bookstore, and I'm sure he would be delighted to sign copies immediately following tonight's forum. Professor Meyer titles his chapter on the 1988 presidential campaign, Furlough from the Truth, the Cynical Racial Politics of 1988. Tonight, we are very honored to have with us someone who needs no introduction in this setting or anywhere, in fact, in this state or in this country, but I will introduce him nonetheless, our great friend and Democratic presidential nominee of 1988, the distinguished former Governor Michael Dukakis. Mike Dukakis was the son of Greek immigrants, and he won his first seat in the Massachusetts legislature in 1962. He served 4 terms as legislator and won his first term as governor in 1974, where he inherited a record deficit and a record high unemployment, and is widely credited as the person who saved Massachusetts at a crucial period in its history, digging the state out of its worst financial and economic crises. In 1986, his colleagues in the National Governors Association voted Mike Dukakis the most effective governor in the nation, and he won the Democratic nomination for the presidency, as we all remember fondly, more so every day, I must say, and was defeated by the first George Bush in an election in which racial politics certainly played a key role, and you will hear more about that this evening. Governor Dukakis is now a professor at Northeastern University and is the co-author of How to Get into Politics and Why, showing his unending optimism and leadership. His book is designed to encourage young people to think seriously about politics and public service as a career, as President Kennedy once said, the noble art of politics. Our moderator this evening is Professor Paul Watanabe of the University of Massachusetts here in Boston. Professor Watanabe's teaching and research interests include American political behavior, ethnic group politics, international relations, and he too is an author, and we're happy to have his books, but I don't have copies of them at hand. He's the author of Ethnic Groups, Congress, and American Foreign Policy, as well as co-author of A Dream Deferred, Changing Demographics, Challenges, and New Opportunities in Boston. So please join me in welcoming again to the Kennedy Library stage Jeremy Meyer, Governor Mike Dukakis, and Paul Watanabe. Jeremy?
Thank you for that introduction. And I'd just like to thank a few people very briefly before I begin. First of all, Tom Putnam for putting all of this together here at the JFK. And it's great to be back at the JFK Library. I went on a 7,000-mile trek alone in my Ford Escort to all the presidential libraries since Eisenhower, and I began with a trip to the Kennedy Library. And I discovered that presidential libraries, like spouses in long marriages, begin to take on the character traits of the president that they're about. So I found that the Kennedy staff were unflappable and witty and classy, and of course the best-looking staff of any of the presidential libraries. And I had some bad experiences at the Nixon Library, which confirmed my theory. I don't want to talk about those. And another thing about the JFK Library that emulates JFK is that they're not afraid of open debate. This book, the 1960 chapter, is quite critical of aspects of President Kennedy's campaign. It takes, I interviewed Sorensen and Schlesinger, and I take issue with some of the things they told me. I find things about the way Kennedy laid his ground for that 60 race that played the game of race quite effectively, more effectively than Nixon, in outreaching to segregationists, reaching out to segregationists in ways that I think previous historians might have missed. I'd also like to express my personal gratitude to Governor Dukakis. It is an honor to have him here on this stage with me. And again, my chapter says some fairly critical things about the campaign, but there's a difference between the campaign that Mr. Dukakis ran and the campaign that George Herbert Walker Bush ran. Mr. Bush does not talk about the campaign in open forums anymore. He gets too angry because of the things that people like me would say about his campaign. Mr. Dukakis, on the other hand, can hold his head high for the campaign he ran, as we'll discuss. I wrote a book about the politics and presidential elections that revolve around race since 1960 up to the 2000. It's how 22 general election campaigns and countless primary campaigns have addressed, avoided, and sometimes exploited the racial divide in America. It's not a book that says race explains everything. The danger when you have a hammer is the whole world looks like a nail. I don't argue that race decided all these elections. In fact, most of them were decided on the usual economics and peace questions. But race played a crucial and sometimes subtle role in elections, even when no one was talking about race. And what surprised me in going back to the 1960 race, for example, is how small a role race played when you looked at just the popular journalistic accounts of the 60 race. That you would have imagined that it was an issue for American politics, that African Americans were second-class citizens and that they couldn't vote in the parts of the country where they were most numerous. But it really wasn't much of an issue for the general voters. What it was an issue for two antipodal factions within American politics. Southern whites, who were very concerned about both parties moving towards civil rights, and of course Northern blacks and Southern blacks, but Northern blacks were different because they could vote. So there was perceived to be this choice that both parties would face. They could either do the Northern strategy and strike hard on civil rights, or they could not do that and appeal to Southern whites. But it was perceived as impossible for either party to do both. Well, in fact, John F. Kennedy managed to do that. He increased the voter turnout or voter support levels over 1956 among African Americans as well as among Southern whites. And the way he did that was through deft positioning on race, through strategies and tactics that narrowcasted. The most prominent example, as the introduction mentioned, was the phone call to Coretta Scott King. Martin Luther King had been imprisoned a few days before the election, and was immediately perceived to be electoral dynamite. And in fact, Bobby Kennedy, his brother's campaign manager, got a phone call from 3 Southern governors that said, if you make any statement about this, you will lose the South. Be quiet on this. But John F. Kennedy, under the advice of 2 staffers who went around Bobby Kennedy, who was much more conservative on matters of race at that time, they got him alone at a motel room in Illinois, and they said, here's a plan, call Coretta Scott King. It won't get covered, it's not a statement, but it will ring like a bell in the black community. And so, acting on sheer raw political instinct, that's what John F. Kennedy did. He made the phone call, and they narrowcasted it as opposed to broadcasted it. They went out and they published 2 million pamphlets that were handed out Sunday before Election Day at black churches saying, a candidate with a conscience versus no comment Nixon. And that, I think, was one of the crucial turning points in that race. But the other half of that story was how Kennedy had been carefully positioning himself as a Northern Democrat who understood the South, as a Northern Democrat who would speak to segregated audiences, which Humphrey would not do, which other Democrats did not do. As a Northern Democrat who was so popular with segregationists that in '56, when he was running for the vice presidential race, he got almost the unified support of the segregationist South at the convention. So Kennedy set a pattern that, in many ways, the candidate who had a real advantage in American elections was the one who understood the subtleties of how America's racial politics were played. That it wasn't about the issues, because in many ways, racial issues didn't change that much, or sometimes you couldn't talk openly about the issues. Race, in most of these elections, was the issue that dared not speak its name, that was not addressed openly, but was addressed through symbolism, code words. And I think one of the best examples of this, in an awful way, is the 1988 race that Governor Dukakis participated in. In 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush had a problem. In May of the election year, he was polling between 17 and 20 points behind the man on the podium, on the stage with me here. And none of the traditional Reagan appeals were working for George Bush. None of the appeals on taxes or defense seemed to be working with focus groups of Reagan Democrats. One issue did work, though, the story of Willie Horton. Willie Horton was a convicted criminal who was an African American, and up to that time he'd been William Horton, by the way, but they shortened his name as part of the Republican tactic. And he'd been released on a furlough policy put into place by Dukakis' Republican predecessor. On the 10th furlough, he escaped, went to Maryland, where he kidnapped a white couple and raped the fiancée repeatedly and was caught. It was a tragedy, and it moved Reagan Democrats away from Dukakis and focus groups that Lee Atwater and Roger Ailes were running. There were three ways in which Willie Horton became a household name, because Lee Atwater said, if I can make Willie Horton a household name, I will win this election. The first was an ad that was allegedly independent of the Bush campaign. Now, it was made by three people who had close association with the Bush campaign, but legally weren't part of it. And it was an ad which featured a mugshot of William Horton. And it was once described as every white suburban mother's greatest fear. And there was no hiding the fact that this was an attempt to inflame race. Along with that, there was a speaking tour for the victims of Horton. The second component was not explicitly racial. It was an official ad by the Bush campaign, which did not mention Horton's race at all, but just told the story of Willie Horton, and Bush's own speeches, where he began to answer questions about his leadership by showing how tough he was on crime. And the subtext was tough on black crime. One of the reasons that Bush was less popular than Reagan was that he was perceived to be a wimp. Reagan had that strong, manly leadership image. Bush didn't. In fact, I argue that the media sexualized Bush's weakness. They had a question on the front page of one of the news magazines that said, Bush, the wimp factor. So he was perceived as this milquetoast patrician with a relatively high-pitched voice and not this Reagan figure. And I argue that he helped establish his manhood, his Clint Eastwood toughness, by saying that he would be a defender of womanhood, read white womanhood, against African Americans. And that worked for him effectively. But that second part of the campaign wasn't about race on the surface, so it gave Bush plausible deniability on race. He could say, as he still does today, that it had nothing to do with race, that it was all about crime. The third part of the Willie Horton campaign was the way the free media, all of the networks, all the local stations, would run that mugshot of Horton again and again and again. And face it, you'd make the same decision too if you were a news director. You have a choice between covering a bland speech by George Bush with footage of that, or running a story that conflates sex, race, and crime together. And that's the choice that news directors again and again were making in 1988. So the American public didn't have to be told by the official Bush campaign that Willie Horton was black. They were being told that by the free media over and over again. It wasn't the only reason that Bush won, but I think it was one of the first and most important reasons that Governor Dukakis began to fall in the polls. And it demonstrated once again the power of race in American elections, that in ways that are sometimes subterranean and sometimes not perceived until after the fact, race can change the outcome of a presidential election in this country. The Democrats learned from 1988, though, They learned to try and stop talking about race. As Bill Clinton in 1992, in a speech in a very white Reagan Democrat county in Michigan, said, "Can't we all just forget about race and be one nation again?" So I call the Clinton policy sort of the policy of forgetting about race, putting race on the back burner, emphasizing economic issues. But the Democrats don't entirely do that. I think that there's room in my book to critique some of the things the Democrats have done to inject race into campaigns, which revisits the narrow-casting tactics of the earlier races. And that is that there is this fear campaign that sometimes appears late in the season of an election when the Democrats need to rally the black vote. In 1996, it was a fake epidemic of church burnings. Black churches were allegedly being burned at a faster rate. It turns out this isn't true, but you wouldn't have known that from the way the Democrats were talking about it. In 2000, a very graphic TV ad which mirrored the aesthetics of the Willie Horton ad was broadcast, and this was the voiceover of that ad. It was over a background of a Texas backcountry road with a pickup truck dragging a chain through the night. This was the voiceover. "I'm Renee Mullins, James Byrd's daughter. On June 7th, 1998, in Texas, my father was killed. He was beaten, chained, and then dragged 3 miles to his death, all because he was black. So when Governor George W. Bush refused to support hate crimes legislation, it was like my father was killed all over again. Call George W. Bush and tell him to support hate crimes legislation. We won't be dragged away from our future." So that now the Democrats in the last 3 election cycles have learned to rally the black vote with, I think, a disingenuous, indeed a deceitful attempt to link the Republican Party to acts of racist violence against blacks. And it's one of the, there's a, in the book I talk about a famous Massachusetts example. Governor Curley, or Mayor Curley, was running for governor in the state of Massachusetts, and he was a Catholic, an Irish Catholic, at a time when that wasn't politically powerful in this state. There was a day when that was controversial, and he would have his employees burn crosses on hillsides in towns before he would speak. And that would give him the ability in his speech to rail against the forces of bigotry that are opposing him. So there are ways in which the race card is being played by both sides today in American politics. I think both are regrettable, but both, again, illustrate the power of race in American elections. There's no worse thing you can say about a candidate than that they're playing the race card. I mean, that's the ultimate nuclear charge in an American election. But again and again, we see politicians on both sides doing it because it works. The question I want to leave you with, which I hope will lead into some discussion, and maybe I hope there'll be some questions here. I see a few people that may remember the 1960 presidential election out there in the audience, so maybe they'll be able to tell me where I was wrong. But the question I want to leave you with is, for how long will race continue to be central to our presidential politics, to our national politics? I argue in the concluding chapter that race is receding and evolving as an issue in American politics, that class will reassert itself as race not vanishes, but evolves and receives. That's not to say there are not today vast inequalities and vast problems and vast differences between black America and white America, and indeed between the Asian America and the Native American America and the Latino America. But we will not be able to say of the 21st century, as Du Bois said of the 20th century, that the color line was the problem of the 20th century. I don't think that will be our problem. It will be one problem among many. So with that, I will turn it over to Paul.
Great. Thanks. I thought to begin with we should hear from the governor and give him some introductory thoughts as well.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Jeremy. First, let me say, John, you didn't mention this, that we had hoped to have a distinguished African-American sociologist on the platform with us from Harvard. Fortunately, he got a terrible asthma attack today. And in fairness to the Kennedy Library, they worked as hard as they possibly could to get a good Republican up here. And they couldn't and they couldn't find one that wanted to talk about race and politics. So if we look somewhat narrow in our whatever outlook, makeup, and so on.
We asked everybody.
They worked at it, believe me. And since this audience is quite diverse, I hope and expect that we'll have lots of good, lively discussion about that. Let me just kind of address this in two ways. First, by commenting briefly on the '88 campaign, and then perhaps looking ahead over the next quarter of a century. You got to be very careful about questioning people's motives in politics. I'm not talking about Jeremy or anyone else doing that. I'm talking about those of us in politics. I learned that lesson very painfully in my early legislative career, where I did that once on the floor of the House, much to my everlasting embarrassment. So I don't really know whether the guy I ran against in 1988 was aware of the racial implications of what was going on, and I say that respectfully. And in any event, from a political standpoint, when you're a candidate, it seems to me you have to be very careful about accusing your opponent of being a racist or participating in racially motivated campaigning. On the other hand, I think as a candidate, one does have a responsibility to try to make sure that whatever you're saying or doing does not appear to be playing the race card. And I don't know about George H.W. Bush, but no television spot ever went on the air on my behalf unless I looked at it, studied it, and approved it personally. Now, maybe, Jeremy, I'm unusual, but I mean, I insisted that every single spot be something that I looked at carefully and approved before it went on the air. Now, it is true, as Jeremy said, that the first Willie Horton spot was not, at least officially, part of the Bush campaign. On the other hand, Roger Ailes called the guy 19 times or something before the thing, and I don't think they were talking about the Red Sox or golf or whatever.
And all three had just worked for him.
That I didn't know, but I mean, we do have a record of 19 phone calls, having gone from Ailes, who of course was the media guy in the Bush campaign, and that ad began running shortly after those focus groups were done, when it was clear that the so-called Reagan Democrats, who we had lost presumably, in which any Democrat who wants to win the presidency has to get back. I don't like the term, but basically we're talking about white, blue-collar Democrats who were disaffected for a variety of reasons from the Democratic Party. And in fact, in either the first or second Reagan campaign, 44% of all union households in the United States were voting for Reagan. So it was a huge problem for Democrats, and by the way, continues to be. White males in particular seem to break in interesting ways politically. So it's a major challenge, and one which obviously I took seriously, because you're not going to win the presidency unless you can build a broad coalition of working folks, people across the economic and political spectrum who are going to support you and support your candidacy. The second thing about the '88 campaign, and obviously this was a huge mistake in retrospect, and one that no Democratic candidate will ever make again, was that I made a calculated decision. It was my judgment, nobody else's, that I would not respond to the Bush attacks. I was reinforced in that, Jeremy, although I'm not going to blame him for this, by the governor of New York, who knows a lot more about politics than I think is a smarter political head than I do, who basically said to me early on, forget about those attacks, nobody's going to believe them, blow them off. 4 days before the election, on the Thursday before the election, when Mario Cuomo and I were campaigning for the last time in New York City, we were out in Queens, and he turned to me and said, that's the worst piece of advice I ever gave you. But I'm not blaming Cuomo for this. I mean, I had the same basic instinct. I'd run what I hoped and thought was a very positive campaign in the primary. I thought people were tired of the polarization that we had gotten during the Reagan years. I'm kind of a positive guy. That's the way I like to campaign. Although, as some of you will recall, this was not the first time I had been the subject of an attack campaign. I was in '78 and I lost to King. I was again in '82 and I won in '82 because I came up with a strategy for dealing with the King attack campaign, which you all may have forgotten, but which was on television nonstop from February to September, and basically said to people, look, he signed the biggest tax increase in history, and if you elect him again, he'll do it to you again. In fact, you may remember vaguely, I see a few familiar faces in this place who went out and worked their dogs off for me from day one. You may remember those King bumper stickers which read DUTAXUS. A little disconcerting when you're driving around the Commonwealth campaigning for governor and looking at these bumper stickers that say "Do taxes," all over the state. But that was part of the King attack campaign, if you will, perfectly legitimate. I don't criticize them for it. Certainly, race wasn't a factor. And that was the year where some of you may recall that I responded by saying, well, this guy may not have raised your taxes, but you're paying a huge corruption tax as a result of this administration. Now, that's what you got to do with attack campaigns, folks. It's not just a question of he throws mud and you throw mud. What you got to do is take the other guy's attack campaign and, if possible, turn it into a character issue on him. I didn't do that in '78 when King attacked me on a whole series of things. I did in '82. It was effective, and I won. And I think it was legitimate. But I made a calculated decision, don't ask me why, 1988, simply not to respond to the Bush attacks. It was a terrible mistake. And it just, as you know, Jeremy, it just didn't involve issues of race. It was that foolish Pledge of Allegiance, by the way, a slight error in your book. The bill wasn't, it's okay. The bill had nothing to do with restoring the Pledge of Allegiance. We've had it, we continue to have it, I support it, and so forth. It had to do with making the refusal of a teacher to lead the pledge a criminal act. That was the issue. That was the law. And of course, anybody who's read the flag salute cases know it's clearly unconstitutional. But that was kind of the other thing. Attack Dukakis' patriotism, why did he sign the bill, and so on and so on and so forth. Well, in retrospect, it was a huge mistake. Now, if you were to say to me, well, okay, with the benefit of hindsight, what would you have done about Willie Horton? I mean, how would you have responded to that? I'm not sure. I haven't spent an awful lot of time thinking about how I'd run the campaign over again. But the reality, folks, was the most liberal furlough program in America in 1988 was the Reagan-Bush furlough program in the federal prison system. And I don't even think George Bush knew they had a furlough program. They were furloughing people for up to 45 days. One of the furloughees went out and murdered a young pregnant mother in the Southwest. Reagan himself had a furlough program in California. Two of his furloughees had murdered people, and he had defended the program. So you don't have to be a brilliant media mind to kind of figure out that there are the raw materials there for an effective response, right? But we didn't do it until very late in the day, as you pointed out, Jeremy. By that time, the damage had been done, and it's very difficult to kind of put those pieces back together again. I guess about the one thing I can take a certain amount of satisfaction in was that what happened, and even the media buy-in, and they did. I mean, that's what you try to do, If you can get the media to run your commercials for nothing, then you've really scored. After it was all over, the national media seemed to be so embarrassed at what had happened to them that the Willie Horton thing became not just a symbol of racial politics, but a symbol of what? Unfair, irresponsible attack politics. And I think to some extent, Jeremy, I'd be interested in your response and your reaction and Paul's too, I think to some extent insulated Bill Clinton from what was a pretty tough attack campaign on Clinton in '92, which just didn't work. Now, admittedly, the economy is in lousy shape. It was about a time for a Democrat to run. But you always had a sense that if Bush began to get too tough on Clinton in '92, Willie Horton. Mm-hmm. Willie Horton. I know the former president has never acknowledged that there was any racial stuff in this, but look, Lee Atwater's no dope, and the guy was big enough just before he died to say, I apologize, because he knew what was going on, and in point of fact, he'd been one of the architects of this. But we've never had any acknowledgement from George H.W. Bush that maybe there was something at least to question about this kind of thing. One other thing which Jeremy, I think, mentions in his book but didn't mention tonight is that not only was there substantial Bush follow-up to all of this, but there was the famous revolving door ad in which you saw prisoners, you remember, coming out of the prison yard and presumably being released with a voiceover saying that Dukakis had done this, that, and the other thing. Well, for one thing, the voiceover was just wrong. It was factually, it was false about how many people had escaped and all that kind of stuff. But if you're at all interested and get a copy of that spot. Take a look at the faces of the actors playing the inmates who are coming out of the prison yard. I mean, there is a distinct. It's not exactly African American. It's not exactly Latino. But let me tell you, folks, most of the people coming out of that jailhouse have complexions substantially darker than the majority of us in this room. And I don't think that was an accident either, as I think you pointed out, Jeremy. I mean, there's nothing subtle about this. So you just look at those faces coming out. Well, okay, let's water over the dam. Dumb campaign, should have been ready, should have had a very carefully thought out strategy for anticipating the attack campaign, which, by the way, Atwater had essentially telegraphed well before they started it. I mean, we knew what they were going to do to us. And you better be ready with a carefully thought out strategy which is designed to blunt the impact of the attack campaign and to repeat, if possible, turn it back on the person that's doing it. And I have to tell you, not that there's any sense of getting into this, but the reason Mitt Romney, in my judgment, won the governorship was because they spent $1 million a week for the last, well, you know, more than 3-4 weeks on an attack campaign, which largely went unanswered by Shannon O'Brien. Largely unanswered. And if you let that happen, folks, you're going to get beat, especially if the person doing it has got unlimited resources. Now, are we over attack politics? Certainly not. I mean, some unidentified spokesman in the White House the other day made a comment about our junior senator, who was the guy they're really worried about in this presidential race, and said that he actually looked French. Fortunately for all of us with a D next to their name, John Kerry has learned the lesson of how you deal with attack politics very well. I mean, he will not let this happen for 1 second, and he was right back on within the same news cycle saying, well, the politics of personal destruction have begun already in the White House, and the campaign isn't even underway. So he knows what's going on, and I think if I've contributed anything to politics in this country, Jeremy, it's the awareness of all candidates now that if you're the subject of this kind of thing, you better be ready for it. You better have a very well thought out strategy for dealing with it, and you better get on it from the beginning, whatever its form, whether it's attacking one's patriotism as they attempted to do with Clinton, right? You know, the Vietnam demonstration that he participated in London when he had a Rhodes Scholarship, or they go after you with the Horton stuff, or anything else for that matter. But believe me, it'll be coming. And in fact, I think it's already begun. Now, where are we going with this issue of race and politics? Folks, I'm no better at this than you are. As I often say these days, if I knew anything about national politics, I'd be here in another capacity. So don't assume that I have any more knowledge of this than you do. I'm inclined to agree with Jeremy's conclusion in his book, which is that over the next, say, quarter of a century, 20 or 30 years, race, at least in a kind of overt sense, or even not so overt sense, will tend to recede, and class, notice I didn't say class warfare, I said class will reassert itself in American politics. What do I mean by that? Well, I hope in 2004 we're going to have a robust debate between the presidential candidates on this tax cut of Bush's. You may like it, you may not like it. You may favor a tax system in which if you work for a living you pay taxes, and if you clip coupons you don't pay any taxes. I mean, if that's what the American people want, then more power to them. But I hope we're going to have that kind of discussion. And since most people of color in this country don't own stock and don't report capital gains because they don't know what a capital gain is, it's just not a part of their life. It seems to me if I'm advising Democratic candidates, Jerry, I'm going to advise them to emphasize issues of economics and fairness and so on and so forth, which not only are legitimate, but at the same time should appeal to the vast majority of African American and Hispanic American people in this country who after all, are not going to gain 2 cents from this proposed tax cut or the kind of economic policies that the current administration represents. On the other hand, as I said, well, I think I agree that that's the direction in which it's moving. I'm not sure. Now, I have the great good fortune, folks, to continue to live and work and teach, and I love my teaching, at Northeastern, a great institution, 9 months of the year. But then, shortly after Christmas, difficult though it is, Kitty and I drag ourselves out of here, and we go off to Los Angeles, where I teach at UCLA for 3 months. It's difficult, it's a terrible burden, but somebody's got to do it. And our kids and grandkids are all in the West, so that's an added bonus. So I've had an opportunity now for the past 8 years, Jeremy, to have a kind of ringside seat. And by the way, I teach, among other courses, I teach an issue called California Policy Issues, which is a way to try to teach public policy using California as a giant case study. So I'm right in the middle of what, and Paul, you're a better student of this by far than I am, but I'm right in the middle of what may well be the harbinger of things to come. I mean, there is now officially no majority anybody in the state of California. I teach approximately 70 undergraduates. I also teach a graduate course, but I teach an undergraduate course of about 70 undergraduates. 2 years ago, just for the hell of it, I went through my list of students. Of the 70 students I was teaching, only 7, my friends, were of European origin, like most of us in this room. 7. Who were the 63? African Americans, Latino Americans, Bangladeshi Americans, Korean Americans, Iranian Americans, Armenian Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans. These kids are going to be running California 20 years from now. I mean, they're the future political leaders of California. Interracial dating, I mean, everywhere. All over that campus and outside that campus and all over Los Angeles. That's the United States. Paul, help me, 30, 40, 50 years from now. Under those circumstances, what happens to race as an issue? Well, it's still going to be an issue, folks. I mean, it's still going to be a problem. Let me put it this way. It may or may not be a political issue. It's going to be a problem. I mean, look, we've got an affirmative action case in front of the Supreme Court. Race is an issue. We have unemployment rates within the Latino and black communities that are still substantially higher, usually double what they are in the white community. The whole issue of educational opportunity, what's happening in many of our schools and school systems and so on and so forth. I mean, you can't divorce these issues from race. I guess the question that I'm not really certain about is whether or not we'll have more visits to Bob Jones University, for example, in Republican primaries. Did that have anything to do with race? I'll say. Rumors that John McCain had adopted a black child. In fact, I think, Jeremy, the McCains adopted a little girl from Bangladesh with a rather dark complexion. Well, those unfortunately were part of the 2000 campaign, in this case in the Republican primary. So the challenge of making this a genuinely race-blind country continues. We're not there by a long shot, though we're certainly several generations ahead of the United States of the 50s when Mike Dukakis began cutting hair on the Swarthmore College campus because the barbershops in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania wouldn't cut the hair of black students at Swarthmore, 9 miles southwest of Philadelphia, without, by the way, the benefit of a license. Don't tell the barber board in Pennsylvania. I'll be in real trouble. So I think I agree with Jeremy that increasingly it will be the politics of class. And I use that in a broad sense. I'm not talking about class warfare. I'm talking about who gets what and under what circumstances and who benefits. But I'm not sure, and that's why it's fun to be here and to be with two very distinguished and thoughtful commentators on the subject, and then to have a chance to spend a little time in this gorgeous setting with this beautiful, absolutely pristine harbor. Just wanted to throw that in behind us to kind of set it up. Paul.
I just want to make three brief points and then actually pose a question to each of our guests. The first is about this issue about attack ads. I do think it's something more than just getting that all attack ads are not equal, and that's what I think it makes it difficult. Attack ads against Democrats on race, I think, are of a particular variety. And that's why I think it makes it's a lot more difficult than just saying one had to respond to them. If you had made those same kinds of ads, and it sounds like you wouldn't have, but if you would have made the same ad against Reagan about the federal furlough program, I would argue that it would have a different kind of resonance and effect than there are particular kinds of ads against particular kinds sticking points. And I think race and Democrats is both maybe the bane and the beauty of Democrats. Maybe this is one of the arguments that you raise about the significant black support for Democrats. But I think it has an effect. It is a little bit like, I don't think it's quite like this now, but sort of in the current environment, the damning attack against anybody who opposes the policies of the current administration is that they're anti-American. And that's a particular kind of an attack, and it's a very difficult one, and it's aimed at a particular, or at least it is assumed that there's a particular point of view attached to it. We'll get in more into this notion about whether race, as the complexion literally of the nation changes, will recede or become more important. I'm not convinced that it will, but both Jeremy and the governor are correct. By the mid part of this century, this country will now be a country that is majority non-white. That is a substantial transformation that is taking place in this country. It's a transformation that the governor points out has taken place in California, not without another uglier side a little bit than the dynamic that he sees within his classroom and on campuses like UCLA. But I still think, I believe it's still up in the air, and in fact I think it will be a significant backlash. And it will not only be sort of racial politics from those who wish to maintain white dominance, but it may also come from those non-white populations too. For some, there will be a belief that now for all of these centuries, it has been a dominant white society. Now that it becomes a dominant non-white society, all of a sudden race is no longer something that we can legitimately think and organize about. And so anyway, I think it's an open question. Thirdly is this, Jeremy's book talks about the relationship, particularly between black America and the Democratic Party, and talks significantly about their level of support. And I think most people know in the last election, 92% of the African American community supported Al Gore. What I think is, and that's fairly consistent, although it wasn't quite that obvious in 1960, and that's where I'm going to begin with my question for Jeremy. But I think the other side that has to be recognized, and Jeremy does point this out, is in fact the dominant white support for Republican candidates. In the 11 elections since 1960 that Jeremy looks at, out of 10 of those, I think the only exception is the Lyndon Johnson landslide in '64, in 10 of those elections, the majority or plurality of white Americans casting votes voted for the Republican candidate. That is a consistent, and one could argue, not the kind of dynamic that is occurring principally in terms of African Americans, but of course, given the size of the white electorate within the United States, that is a significant and consistent Republican advantage. Let me begin by asking Jeremy a question about 1960, and I think the 1960 and 1988 elections are the ones we might want to focus on a little here at the start. In 60, Jeremy talks about the fact, and he makes a really convincing case that it was a real open question about where the African American vote, as it existed at least, was going to go. He argues, I think he pretty much says, that Nixon's record on civil rights was probably better, certainly as a legislator and even as vice president, than was Senator Kennedy's. And he has this discussion back and forth that really the black vote was up for grabs. At least 40% of it went to Dwight Eisenhower in the '56 election. Then he talks about what everybody has mentioned here, the call to Coretta King. And my question is this. One gets the impression if John Kennedy had not made that call, and if Richard Nixon had made the call as he was being urged to do by people like Jackie Robinson and others, as I understand it, would the African American vote have split like it did in that election?
I argue that it would not have. That there's very few moments in an election where you can say, had this not occurred, the outcome would have been different. But I think this is one of those cases. Now, in an election as close as 1960, you can point to almost any social group and say it was the farmers in Iowa, or it was, the urban workers or whatever. But I really think that that phone call is one of those turning points in an election, one of those rare moments where you can say this made the difference. Nixon didn't have a better civil rights record than Kennedy, but he had at least a comparable one. And within his party, he was one of the leading Republicans for civil rights. Kennedy was not. He had a very weak record on civil rights. And it's funny, it's about public memory. We remember Richard Nixon of 68 and 72 because of the way he played the race card and the way he wooed the South, because he learned not to reach out on civil rights because of 1960. There's a memo in the Eisenhower Library that talks about a post-election loser discussion with Eisenhower and Nixon and the head of the Republican Party going, how could we lose this? It was so close. And Nixon said all that time spent outreaching to blacks was wasted. And the head of the Republican Party said as far as he was concerned with the black vote, the hell with them. And I argue in the book that became unofficial Republican Party policy, that they never tried again for the black vote thereon after. I forgot what I was starting to talk about. Well, there was something about my book, but the question was, yeah, so if Nixon had made that phone call and Kennedy had not, and a lot of people told Kennedy not to do it, I think that Nixon would have gotten more than the 32% of the black vote that he got, and if he'd done that, he would have been elected president.
Wow. You also mentioned about the narrow casting of it. One thing that you do point out in your book is that Kennedy was not above doing some narrow casting of his own. That is, sending out some flyers which was showing Nixon with three, I think, African Americans, really raising the argument that Nixon was getting too cozy with African Americans and highlighting the fact that he was a member of the NAACP, playing these, narrow casting these in the South to use Nixon's relationship with African Americans against him in the South.
Yeah, I have a photo in the book of this very racist pamphlet that was handed out. It's not an official Kennedy piece of literature. It's by independent Democrats in Virginia, but it follows the attack book of the Kennedy campaign, which is still here at the library, which says, in the North, attack Nixon for being weak on civil rights, but in the South, attack him for being a friend of Martin Luther King and a member of the NAACP. So the Kennedy campaign was doing a better straddle on race than Nixon was, and this literature confirms that that was a tactic used. Nixon really was associated in the minds of many white Southerners as Mr. Civil Rights. Kennedy was not by 1960. If Kennedy had been shot in 62 and not 63, he would not be remembered today as this fighter for civil rights. He benefits from the last year of his life when he did take brave stands on civil rights, and he also benefits from the brave stands of his brother on civil rights from 62 to 68. But we remember Kennedy and Nixon through the filters of the last years of their lives, but this Kennedy and Nixon of 1960 were very different men.
You know, Governor, when I was reading Jeremy's book, he begins by indicating a little bit that he thought that you lacked some familiarity with issues of race at the beginning and so forth. And I must confess that when I read that, the story that I thought of was the one you related about going to Swarthmore and becoming barber Dukakis. And the reason why is because the barbers wouldn't cut the hair of black kids, so you decided to be their barber.
Out of the barbershop.
And I thought that reflected some early understanding about race in America. So I must say, exactly the same thought came to my mind when I read that. But Governor, Jeremy makes a big point about Jesse Jackson as a critical factor in really 84, 88, and 92. And he consistently kind of argues that dealing with Jesse Jackson was really the issue for what he calls the last white man standing in each of those elections. That's the final thing you had to do to secure the nomination and possibly win the election. Tell us something about that. Was he such a puzzle to you? What was the relationship and what was the issue with him?
Look, Jesse is a brilliant guy. He's the most eloquent guy in American politics. Certainly was I've often said I never listened to Jesse in that campaign, and I had to listen to him a lot. Of course, he had to listen to me a lot. We had, if you can believe this, 45 official debates between and among the candidates. I made 39 of them, and he made at least 39. Never listen to Jesse Jackson without learning something. Either learning something, period, or learning something about how you expressed a thought in ways that I certainly couldn't. On the other hand, Jesse Jackson is one of the most difficult people in America to deal with. I mean, he just is, folks. I mean, he's just very difficult. That whole business about notifying him that I'd picked Benson. I mean, he was on a plane. I had made a decision the night before, Jeremy, to go with Benson. Called him at about 11:30 at night. He had taken the phone off the hook, apparently, because the press was driving him crazy. I caught him at 6 in the morning with lather on his face. He was shaving. I said, Senator, Mike Dukakis, I'd like you to be my running mate. He said, I'm honored, but I'd like to talk to my wife. I said, fine, call me back after you get the lather off your face and finish shaving. He did. About a half an hour later. They talked about it, and he said yes. So I heard from him, I think, at 6:30, 6:45, and then I had to get on the phone to notify all of the other folks we had been looking at, including Jesse. By that time, Jesse was on the plane. Now, it took me a while to get a hold of Dick Gephardt, took me a while to get a hold of Al Gore, took me a while to get a hold of John Glenn, took me a while to get a hold of Jesse. The only person who was insulted by all of this was Jesse. But I'm sorry. I mean, you got to let the guy you're asking to run with you know that you want him, and you got to wait for his response before you get on the phone and call people to say, sorry, but it's Benson. Jesse's difficult. Brilliant, but difficult. And, I remember inviting him and his wife, Jackie, to come and have dinner with us on 4th of July night, and then to go to the Pops and watch Kitty's dad conduct the Pops. And what was the comment somebody said?
He said he felt he was treated like
on the plantation or something?
Yeah, it's an even worse. I think he said house nigger.
Yeah, I don't know what the hell he was talking about. I have no idea what that man was talking about when he made that comment. I mean, Kitty and I invited him to the house. We had a catered meal. I'm sorry, it was salmon with egg sauce and peas. That's what we eat. And we had, by the way, had notified his office 4 times. Did he like fish and so on and so forth? Wouldn't eat it, you know. Ordered fried chicken at the Esplanade. I kid you not. I kid you not. But I'll be damned if I understand what that was all about. I thought we had a pleasant visit, despite the fact that he wouldn't eat the fish. And Jackie, who's a delight, frankly, you know, was charming and pleasant. Then we went on down to the Esplanade and listened to a concert. But this was one of my failed attempts to build bridges between the Dukakises and the Jacksons. So, you know, he's difficult, but then politics is difficult. I mean, you got to deal with that, and we did our best to do so. But I was not the only Democratic nominee that had that problem, as we all know. Fritz Mondale had a much more difficult problem.
There's a picture in the book that, if you don't buy the book, at least thumb through the pictures. That kind of captures that 4th of July awkwardness, having the 4 of them sitting there, and it was.
Well, but again, Jeremy, let me say this to you. I didn't feel awkward. I don't think Kitty felt awkward. And we loved the Esplanade, and we loved my recently departed father-in-law, who everybody loved, right? By the way, I'm now down only one haircutting customer. Just lost one in Harry Dixon. My 4-year-old grandson in Denver's the only other guy whose hair I cut these days. So anyway, it's the only way I can keep my. But you know, I mean, for us, the Esplanade on the 4th of July is it's Boston. It's what we do. It's you know, needless to say, Kitty's dad and the whole symphony thing, which was part of her life, and what, 250,000 people out there listening to music. So we thought it'd be kind of. And by the way, it was my idea to invite the Jacksons to Boston and have supper and then go to the Esplanade together. We thought it was a great way to kind of have a good time in a kind of social sense, because, you know, he and I had been on a gazillion platforms together during the campaign, and we'd never really had a chance to sit down with him and his wife and just kind of have a social evening. So don't ask me. I mean, what can I tell you? He's brilliant, he's eloquent, and he's difficult.
Is it true that some members of your staff advise you to take a different tactic towards handling him?
No. On the other hand, if you talk to John Sasso, I mean, he'll tell you he had very difficult conversations with Jesse. Very difficult conversations. And Sasso's about the most reasonable guy in the world, and the calmest person in the world. But he's tough, you know. So, but then he's not the only person who's difficult in politics, believe me.
We want to, in the tradition of these forums at the Kennedy Library, allow people to give us a question or a statement in the form of a question. I think they go to these microphones here. Let me just say something. If I were writing a book review of Jeremy's book, I would love it. I would urge you to buy it and so forth. I can't figure out the footnotes, by the way, Jeremy. It's a very weird...
Oh, it's the publishers. It's a trade publication. They hope to sell some to non-academics. So rather than having it with I had, I think, 1,400 footnotes when it was first turned in. What they do is they have invisible footnotes. So when you're reading something, you go to the end and it says notes for page 60, and then it'll have that first line of text, and then you find out where I found that out. And academics who read it go, this is not easy. We want a footnote. And people who read it, and I'm not meaning to say that we're not people, I think may appreciate the fact that there's not, at least that's what my editors.
Well, I have 16 students in my research seminar, which should be meeting right now, do not footnote the way he does.
I don't let my students do this.
And let me say this, not to prolong this, but even a non-academic academic like me, every once in a while, when you use a quote, I'd say, who the hell said that? And I'd look down at the bottom of the page, or, you know, somewhere, couldn't find it. So now I know I got to go to the back of the book.
The back of the book, and it would say notes for this page, and then it just goes by.
Let me just add, that was not my substantive critique, believe me. That would not have been it. The one thing that I wish that Jeremy would do, and maybe it's his next book, and he's young and he's got a lot more in him, I think, is to look at the issue of race. I'm not convinced Du Bois is wrong about this century. But at least it will be a different kind of politics and race, and it is what the governor talked about, the changing complexion of the country. And the one thing that I think will be very important in that, Jeremy makes a very good point about the transformation with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64, 65. The fact that African Americans have been here as long as anybody else, really, in terms of the population, but they really didn't get enfranchised and become, therefore, a part of the political process in a significant national way until that time. And that had a big, profound influence on American politics. What I would argue is with the influx of immigrants, particularly from Latin America and Asia into the United States, and that is significant, by the way. The Asian American community, which I am a part of, you have to realize that over 70% of the adults are foreign-born. This is a population that is not, at least even formally, to a considerable degree, eligible to participate in voting. I would argue when that population, particularly Latino and Asian American, when they become citizens and therefore then become eligible to vote, will be as dramatic and as significant a transformation in the eligible electorate as was the and probably more, in fact, given the Latino community, the enfranchisement of African Americans in the mid-1960s. And that's why I think racial politics, or at least this issue, will be a significant one. How it plays out, I'm not sure. This gentleman here, go ahead.
The first comment I'd like to make is that there are other races in the country. And while it's often said that by 2050 the majority of people in this country will be non-white, I think the reality is more like by the end of the century a majority of people in this country will have Spanish surnames, which is slightly different, especially with the census changing categories, Hispanic, white, Hispanic, non-white. And then also in 1988, Bush had 6 members of far-right groups on his campaign team, including someone named Florian Galdar, who was recruited for the Romanian Iron Guard, a fascist organization. Not neo-fascist, but like good old-fashioned World War II fascist organization. But funnily enough, the Democrats didn't really make use of that. But I really want to talk about the Democrats using negative racial ads in their presidential campaigns or tactics. We know the Republicans have a bad record. Reagan, I believe, launched his 1980 campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is known for one thing and one thing only. But I'm glad you brought up the Jackson-Benson issue. I was going to if you hadn't. But we still need to address the whole Stop Jackson campaign in 1988. and also the Sister Soldier episode in 1992. It does seem as if Democratic candidates have to show they're not soft on race, and one way to do that is show they're not soft on Jesse Jackson, who actually does deserve more respect, given that he gets the black vote for you guys. And Ron Walters has also pointed out that whites vote for Republicans 55-45 in these presidential elections, and it's the non-white vote which gives the Democrats any chance.
Can I interrupt, and let's deal with actually the Sister Soldier, because it's actually dealt with in the book, and I was struck in the same way that some advice given to, I think, Clinton or other, they need to have a Sister Soldier movement, a moment when
Someone says that's why Gore didn't win.
When the race issue gets a little dicey. So maybe you can talk
Well,
about
it isn't just Sister Soldier. What I argue in 92 is that Clinton insulated himself on race so he wouldn't be attacked. In fact, we talk about Willie Horton in 88. In 1992, a man died because of racial politics, and that was Ricky Ray Rector. He was a convict, brain damaged in Arkansas, and Clinton left the campaign trail in New Hampshire. He didn't have to do that. He could have let the lieutenant governor preside over this killing. Came back to be there when he was executed, as if to say, I am executing a man, but exercising a ghost, the ghost of Willie Horton, from the Democratic Party, so that he could not be attacked the way Governor Dukakis was. So there was a lot of ways that Clinton disrespected Jackson, carefully planned out how he would attack Sister Soldier at Jackson's Rainbow Coalition. But Clinton also developed his own homegrown black leadership. Ron Brown was not a national figure. The Vernon Jordan was a fading light in the African-American civil rights community until Clinton rejuvenated both of these men and brought them in and said, I don't need Jackson. I don't have to do what Dukakis and Mondale did. And it was a very effective tactic. And I think that if I was a Democrat running for president today, I think there's a real benefit to attacking Al Sharpton early and attacking him hard, because it establishes that this guy isn't credible. Al Sharpton is not qualified to be president, and there's a good electoral payoff for a Democrat who's brave enough to say that.
Governor, any comment?
Well, I wasn't happy with the Sister Soldier thing, and I would be very unhappy, Jeremy, with a Democratic candidate who deliberately went after Sharpton. Now, why do I say that? Because I think, but having said that, let me also say that if, Jesse's got to earn respect as well. I mean, if you call up somebody's campaign manager and call him a racist, I'm not going to take that stuff either. So it's a two-way street. But I think that the task of the Democratic nominee in 2004 is to be a unifier and not to engage in this kind of game playing, if I may say. Again, what do I know about national politics? Not much. But I don't want to see us engage in that kind of stuff. Al Sharpton's Al Sharpton. He's entitled to run. I think you respect him as a candidate. You treat him respectfully and well. I mean, he's entitled to be a candidate, and so when he's out there on the stump and you're debating and so forth, you treat him the way you treat anybody else, with respect and with dignity. And my own view is that if we're going to have a Kerry administration in 2005, as I hope we are, that's the way the junior senator from Massachusetts will conduct his campaign when it comes to these kinds of issues. Just one other thing. Let me just add while I'm here on the whole question of the emergence of the Latino community. Politically, that is already making itself felt dramatically in California. I mean, about a quarter of the California Assembly is now Latino. Two of the last the last four speakers of the Assembly have been Latino. It is true that a Latino candidate did not get elected mayor of Los Angeles, but he came damn close, and he'll probably be running again. He just got elected to city council. So we're seeing that. On the other hand, folks, there's nothing new under the sun. What was Sacco Vanzetti all about anyway? Think about it. What was Sacco Vanzetti all about? When I first ran for the legislature in 1962 in this state, it was inconceivable that a Greek American could be elected governor. I mean, inconceivable. Not because people didn't like us. I mean, you like us. It wasn't in the ethnic politics of the state, Paul. I mean, Greek. I mean, you either had to be an Irish Catholic, a Yankee Brahmin, otherwise you didn't get elected. Foster Ferkalo was kind of half and half. And he was. I mean, he was half Italian, half Irish, I guess. But Boston just elected its first Italo-American mayor a few years ago. First. I mean, there was an enormous amount of, there was some professor at Princeton in the late teens who wrote a book on the basic intellectual inferiority of Southern Europeans, which, by the way, had a lot to do with kind of the intellectual justification for the Immigration Act of 1924. William James went into the predominantly Eastern European Jewish slums of New York back in the late 19th century and said these people are monkeys. I mean, that was the dialogue at the time. So we've had to deal with, not to mention Chinese exclusion acts in 1882 and of course what happened to the Japanese American community during World War II. I mean, this is not a new issue here. We've been dealing with issues of race and ethnicity for a long time, and I suppose the issue is how do we deal with them in the future, and how do we do it in a way that, as I say, brings people together and doesn't deliberately go out to insult folks, disrespect them, and particularly for political reasons. I mean, I find that kind of offensive, to tell you the truth.
Good. Sir?
Governor, it's an honor to hear your analysis and your anecdotes. I'm thinking back to when Senator Gary Hart was in the 1984 campaign with Jesse Jackson and Walter Mondale, won 25 presidential primaries and so forth. And he looked like for sure that he would be the man in '88. And I believe if we know anything about the Bush folks and the people behind them, that we've grossly underestimated them as Democrats. And it's by no small coincidence that for the past quarter of a century, with the exception of one cycle, they've been on the presidential ticket. And they're determined to hold on to power, fog and mirrors, everything else, religion, race, whatever you want to mix in. You mentioned that Senator Kerry, you hoped that he would be the president in the White House, and that would be a nice change from what we've got at present. I believe that also respectfully, as the other gentleman, Jerry, said, a man changes and gives a lot to his country, as John F. Kennedy asked, rather than stooping to conquer, as our opponents seek to do, capitalizing on their wealth to use it to devise, using talk radio and religion and everything as that means. My question is, do you think that this stooping to conquer has gone so far as the White House has deliberately ignored the warnings of the Hart-Rudman Commission on the World Trade Center attacks of 2001?
I don't think the White House ignored the work of that commission any more than previous administrations ignored the recommendations of others. We just weren't taking this issue of Homeland Security seriously, my judgment. We were facing an international criminal conspiracy. When you do that, you got to deal with it as a criminal conspiracy. And it isn't that we didn't have fair warning given what happened to the World Trade Center the first time, right? But I wouldn't lay this at the feet of just the Bush administration. This was a failure of administrations, both Republican and Democrat, to take this seriously, which, and I don't want to digress here, is what is so ironic about our criticism of the French and others, because if we're going to fight this international criminal conspiracy, we need those folks badly. They know a lot more about terrorism than we do, and they got to be part of this effort to break this conspiracy. I mean, if there's one lesson you'll learn in politics, it is that the guy who's against you today may be with you tomorrow, so don't burn your bridges, folks. Don't burn your bridges. Look out. On the other hand, I'm not surprised that this administration, the Republican Party, plays hardball politically. The challenge for Democrats is to deal with that and go out and win. And we've demonstrated that under the right circumstances, with the right kind of campaign, which I didn't run, unfortunately, in 1988, you can win. By being inclusive, by emphasizing fundamental economic issues, which incidentally, are particularly relevant to people of color. I mean, look at the 44 million people that don't have health insurance in this country and do an analysis of how many of those are people of color. 40% of the people in Los Angeles County, overwhelmingly Latino American, don't have a dime of health insurance. And they're working. They're members of working families. So it's that approach, it seems to me, that the Democratic Party has to embrace and adopt and go at the, I mean, we haven't heard the phrase trickle-down economics for a long time. Clinton used it every day. That's what we're getting these days out of this administration. Well, let's hear it. I'm not hearing it. I mean, that's the kind of thing, it seems to me, it's got to be part of a winning campaign in 2004. And to repeat, I am no expert at winning presidential campaigns. Sir.
We heard the word wimp here before, used in connection with Bush 41. But Governor Dukakis, I'm sure that we all remember, including yourself, your famous impotent response to Bernard Shaw, which probably, in the minds of the voters, a connection was made there between that response and your other conduct, and your failing to answer properly other accusations. So we mustn't forget that. I always find it amusing that whenever Willie Horton comes up as a topic at forums like this in which Democrats or liberals predominate, people like Ailes and Atwater and the Republicans always get pounded more than Willie Horton himself does, the murderer, rapist, torturer. And I think that happened again here today. Governor Dukakis, how much have you speculated on what would have happened had Al Gore not been the first to point to Willie Horton of all your opponents in '88, although not by name and by no description? Perhaps if Al Gore had not mentioned Willie Horton in any way, perhaps what followed may not have followed. And finally, Governor Dukakis, Willie Horton has always proclaimed his innocence of everything. All the charges, all of the convictions. He's innocent of everything. Question for you is, have you considered working with him and perhaps talking with him and perhaps looking into his evidence in the day that perhaps you might help to clear him, since he claims he's innocent, and thereby rehabilitate your own image?
Well, there's a number of questions there. The answer to the last question is no. I've not seriously considered spending time trying to determine whether or not Willie Horton is innocent. I think he was guilty. He was convicted, and best of my knowledge, the conviction was justified. On the other hand, suggesting that Al Gore was responsible for the Bush attack campaign is nonsense. Look, Andy Card and a bunch of folks up here began engaging in negative research for the Bush campaign at an early stage when it appeared that Mike Dukakis might be the nominee. And the Willie Horton case was no mystery. It won the Lawrence Eagle Tribune a Pulitzer Prize. I never could understand why, but it did. And it was a matter of great controversy and a lot of debate and discussion over whether or not we ought to have a furlough program, even though, by the way, I had substantially toughened up the Sergeant furlough program before Willie Horton, and whether or not it was appropriate ever to furlough first-degree murders and so on and so forth. I mean, there's been an enormous amount of discussion on that subject. And in fact, the furlough program for first-degree murders was abolished well before the campaign got underway, as a result of the uproar over the fact that he had done what he had done while on furlough. 45 out of 50 states in the United States had a furlough program. To repeat, the most liberal of them all was the furlough program in the Reagan-Bush administration. So the fact that Al Gore raised this issue in 1 out of 45 Democratic debates, not by name, I responded, that was the end of it. Is foolishness. I mean, the fact of the matter was that this was very well known, and Bush and his people decided to use it, and shame on me for not being ready for it and having a carefully thought out way of dealing with it that not only blunted the attack, but, to repeat, as I said earlier on, turned it into an issue on Bush, given the fact that he was the vice president of the administration that had a furlough program that was as loose as marbles, let me tell you. Can you imagine furloughing people for a month and a half? A lot of them escaped, a lot of them ran, a lot of them committed crimes subsequently, and so on and so forth, including this particularly horrendous one down in either Arizona or New Mexico. But don't blame Al Gore for that. That's nonsense. The fact of the matter was that it was out there, it had been a big issue, and none of us should have been surprised that the Bush people picked it up and ran with it.
If I could, I do address this in the book, and the Republicans always say that Al Gore was the person that brought it to their attention. That's just factually not true. It was already in Reader's Digest, and but Gore's use of it didn't cause the Bush campaign to use it, and Gore's use of it was just quantitatively different from, there weren't Gore attack ads about it. It wasn't the centerpiece of the Gore campaign. It was something he mentioned in one debate, as the governor mentioned. And also the implication that because we're up here saying that Ailes and Atwater exploited matters of race to win the White House does not in any way mean that we're somehow saying Willie Horton doesn't deserve to be in jail. It's not about being for or against punishing crime. It's about having campaigns that aren't run on the basis of very deceptive claims, such as the NAACP made in 2000 about James Byrd, and such as were made against the governor in 1988 by the Republicans.
Okay, and let's hope you're not part of the Democratic liberal soft on crime majority in this room, but we'll see.
First, thanks to the three of you for a great program today. Second, I have a bland, non-incendiary question. I'd be interested in the comments of any of you about the Southern strategy that I believe was devised by Lee Atwater and implemented in the Nixon campaigns. How effective was it then, and is it still relevant?
I'm sorry, I missed it.
How effective was that?
Well, the Southern strategy.
And is it still relevant somewhat today, or in the 2000 campaign, the Southern strategy?
Right. There have only been 3 presidents elected since President Kennedy who were Democrats, or 3 elections that went to the Democrats, and they were all by Southern men. So the Southern strategy has been a very powerful weapon that the Republicans use. It's one of the big stories of American politics in the last 40 years. It continues to be effective, and it's not all about race. It's about guns. It's about God. I have a friend who runs Republican campaigns in Oklahoma, and he says we run on the 3 Gs: guns, God, and gays. And the Republicans are doing that very well, but it has been about race, and it's increasingly, or it's decreasingly about race in the South or the Republican Party, but it began on race. That's what pulled the white Southerners away. It wasn't Lee Atwater, by the way, who designed the Nixon in 68, 72, but he was the one who revitalized it for 88.
Let me say one other thing, too. A lot of people said to me, what was the biggest surprise for me personally in the 1988 campaign? It wasn't the kind of thing that we've been talking about tonight. I wasn't surprised at that. It was the gun culture outside of the Northeast. It was the gun culture outside of the Northeast. I mean, look, I come from a part of the country where I think most of us believe that you should have an absolutely compelling reason before you're permitted to walk around with a concealable handgun, right? You get into western Pennsylvania and it starts changing. I'm not kidding you.
That's Alabama, western Pennsylvania,
well,
essentially.
Maybe so. The American rifleman is read from cover to cover by 3 million Americans, at least, who are members of the NRA. And I was the American rifleman's poster boy for several months during 1988. I've never made any bones about the fact that I think we need tough controls on concealable handguns, and I'm either foolish enough or wise enough to believe that the fact that in this state, if you're caught with a concealable handgun without a license to carry, you go to jail for a year. Mandatory. It's one of the few mandatory sentences I support, but I support it very strongly. So you get out beyond, the Northeast, and I want to tell you, it's just this right to have a gun. I mean, it's a constitutional right. Of course, it isn't. At least I don't think it is, unless. I mean, who knows what the Supreme Court will do tomorrow? But anyway, but it's astonishing. Yeah. School closed down and businesses closed down. People go out and hunt. I got no problem with hunting and all that kind of stuff. If you want to do that, but I'm talking about concealable handguns, this kind of thing. And I don't know how many states, folks, today, including Texas, with the signature of George Bush when he was governor, now have what are called right-to-carry laws, which not only don't require you to get a permit, it essentially, I mean, maybe it's a very loose permitting system, but essentially the presumption is that you ought to have a gun if you want it, because we'll all be safer off under those circumstances. I kid you not. So it's not just race out there. It's this kind of stuff and certain religious issues and so on.
Yeah, I'm from Utah, and I grew up there. That's why I'm here. And that's actually why Mitt is here. He won't tell you that why he ran for governor here instead of Utah. But the debate in Utah literally is, you're absolutely right, Governor, about whether kids should be banned, people should be banned from taking them into schools and into court, into the courts. By the way, they've upheld that you can't. Okay, here and then here. I think we'll be right on time if you keep it short.
I'll try to. Thank you. I may ask, some of the folks in the back didn't know what the Sister Soldier event was, so if you have time, maybe you can tell some of us what that was. But that's not my question, so you have to hold on.
Buy the book. It's outlined in great detail.
Very quickly, I would love to get your opinions on the 2000 campaign and what happened in Florida, specifically northern Florida, where minority voters were somewhat prevented from voting. And certainly in the black communities, certainly with the recounting that took place and halted, and the Supreme Court eventually kind of chose the president. But as you have traveled the country doing your research, do you see that kind of voting limitations as more systemic around the country, or specifically in the South?
Okay.
Or is it?
Okay. Excuse me. Before you answer, can we at least have her question, and then we'll just wrap it up?
Okay.
Good evening. Good evening, Governor.
Hi there.
My question has to do really with local politics and how they correlate to national politics in reference to the Democratic Party. I'm very, very concerned about when the Democratic Party in its leadership will really stand up and support a candidate of color in more than just a race where they live, where in fact candidates of color would be able to represent all of the people. Here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I can't tell you, I mean, I was born and bred in this town. I can't tell you any person of color that has had, that's a Democrat, has been a Democrat their lifelong, person of color ran and has had limited, if any, support from the majority of the Democratic Party. That's my question.
Okay, so respond to both these questions if you guys would.
Okay. First, Sister Soldier was an event that Jesse Jackson, he was having a Rainbow Coalition meeting after the LA riots, and Clinton went to the event and he attacked Sister Soldier. It was his largest response to the LA riots. Soldier was this little-known rap star who had said, well, finally blacks took a week off from killing each other to start killing white people. And it was a comment made in real anger. And from Clinton's response, it was as if that was the cause of the riots. That was the big problem. And it was, as one commentator described it, woofing for the benefit of white people. It made a real unpopular response in the audience, but it made a good response on the TV screens of racial conservative whites. So that was the tactics. Your other question was about the 2000 election in Florida. I've done some research on this. I don't think a lot of the wild allegations that were made by Jackson and Sharpton actually hold water. That when you go back and you look at the stories of the police, this, that, and the other, they usually don't hold up. But the real story in Florida is that between 8,000 and 9,000 names were illegally struck from the rolls. Katherine Harris violated a court order which told her not to do that. These were people that had been convicted of crimes in other states and then moved to Florida. They were not eligible to be struck from the rolls, and it was done very haphazardly and carelessly by a Republican-affiliated company. And if you take out those 9,000 votes, most of the minority, and the minority vote in Florida was 95% Gore, that's the election right there, no question, no doubt about it. So the real scandal happened months before the election in terms of the actual racial politics of Florida. So, and then on the local question, I think that's more your...
Well, let me respond on 2000 by simply saying that if Al Gore had visited Tennessee a few times while vice president, there would have been a different result. And while I think Bill Clinton's the most talented person I've ever worked with in public life, if he behaved himself, Gore would have won by 15 percentage points. Now, having said that, I thought the good news about Florida was this huge increase in turnout in the African-American community. I mean, it was huge. You documented
60%.
Incredible. And I don't know what happened in Jacksonville. I know what happened in Palm Beach. A lot of my folks I used to teach when I used to teach down there at FAU were thoughtful, intelligent, older people walked in there and thought they were voting for Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. when it turned out they were voting for Buchanan. I mean, these people, would be struck dead in a minute if by their own hand if they knew they were voting for Buchanan. Buchanan admitted it. It was an invalid ballot. I mean, it was an illegal ballot, and for reasons I've never understood, the courts would not, in effect, recognize the intent of those voters, which, after all, is supposed to be the real test of whether or not you've cast a vote and for whom. But, there are all kinds of coulda, shoulda, woulda stuff. Fact of the matter is we should have won that election going away, and I think most of us know why we didn't. I mean, the only issue Bush really had was the ethics and the moral tone of the White House and restored dignity of the White House and all that stuff, and it was all the result of my long, my good friend and a guy I worked with very closely over the years who just, wouldn't behave himself. So I think that's really more the story rather than, I mean, Scalia was a classmate of mine at law school. And even then he was to the right of Marie Antoinette. But let me tell you something. He was a strong opponent of aggressive federal court action in class. Never forgot it. Engaged in long discussions with a sainted man named Henry Hart, who taught the course in federal courts and federal jurisdiction. This is, by the way, in 1960. Whether it's ever appropriate, this is in 1960, for a federal court to step in and take a case away from the state court. And there was this guy. I didn't even know him because he hadn't been in my section. Finally, I turned to the guy next to me. And I said, who is this guy? He said, he's Scalia. He's on the law review. I'll never forget it, Jeremy. I turned to him and said, does he know what it's like to be black in the South? Is he serious? This is 1960. Little did I know that my classmate Scalia would become an advocate for a sweeping assertion of the Supreme Court's power over local elections. Couldn't believe it. Now, I have no answer, and you and I have been working at this for a long time, except to say that we did have a candidate, and a damn good one, who the party leadership supported for Secretary of State, and he got beaten in a primary. Remember? Now, that's no excuse for our failure to encourage new leadership for the African American and, for that matter, the Latino community, because we've got to, and we're not doing it. But and if we don't do it, we shouldn't be surprised if we aren't the kind of party we should be, and we don't get the kind of support across the board that I'd like to think you and I and a lot of other people worked hard to build back during the last Democratic administration, whenever it was, a long time ago in the State House.
And the Republicans are doing it. I mean, Republicans are showing that they will vote. White Republicans are voting for conservative black candidates in Maryland and in other states. And so far it hasn't really moved their numbers in the black community, but it will if that continues and the Democrats don't come up with a response.
John, do you have the final word?
Well, the final word is to thank this really extraordinary panel and to note that this is a very difficult subject, and you have elucidated it in so many different ways. Governor, I can't resist concluding this afternoon without saying, if there were the decency and vision and just down-to-earth common sense of Michael Dukakis, we would all be better off in the White House. And we've seen it right here again on display this afternoon, just as we've seen it all through his career. Jeremy, Meyer, Governor Dukakis, Paul Watanabe, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.